Chapter 11, Part 3, Aristotle's Virtue Ethics. It's going to be helpful to lay out the details of a particular virtue theory at some length. Since no real consensus exists among contemporary virtue theorists, we're going to look at the most famous and influential of all virtue theories. This is the theory of Aristotle. So the idea here is that by looking at an example of virtue ethics, it will sort of help clarify how virtue ethical theories work in general. According to Aristotle, human beings seek happiness. The Greek word here is eudaimonia. Everything we do, say, and think is ultimately aimed at attaining this happiness, at attaining eudaimonia. But what is happiness? So, for Aristotle, it's not simply pleasure. In Aristotle's sense, eudaimonia relates to our flourishing or fulfillment as human beings, right? So happiness here isn't just simply feeling good, it's instead this idea of flourishing as people. And I think that we maybe don't normally think of happiness that way, but we can certainly recontextualize it to do so. For Aristotle, we can find fulfillment only when we achieve our purpose or function. This is the good of human existence. But what's our purpose or function even supposed to be? Whatever it is, it needs to be uniquely human, because it needs to set human nature apart from everything else. Now, this was just an important characteristic for Aristotle. He wanted to identify what was uniquely human. Aristotle concludes that our unique function is our ability to order and direct our lives by reason, to live in accordance with reason. From this, we can infer that to attain happiness or fulfillment, we must live by reason. Of course, and as I'm sure we all know, some people obviously do this better than others. Those who do it the best achieve the highest degree of human excellence or virtue, at least according to Aristotle. Virtuous people are those who are most skilled at ordering all facets of their life in accordance with reason. And we're going to kind of see how this works as we move through. While a complete virtuous character includes all of the virtues, Aristotle distinguishes two different kinds of virtues. There's intellectual virtue. This is a virtue developed through teaching. And then there's moral virtue. And moral virtue is a virtue that requires practice. To develop any particular moral virtue, we must practice the very sorts of acts that virtue typically produces, right? So to become courageous, for instance, we must practice acting courageously. To become generous, we must practice generosity. I can act virtuously without being virtuous. I think that we all maybe know people like this, people who can act virtuously, but they're not, in fact, virtuous. Developing virtue is somewhat analogous to developing skills at playing a sport or a musical instrument. This is kind of a nice model to think of this. To become good at tennis, you must spend countless hours practicing forehands and backhands, serves, lobs, and so on. And pianists similarly need to practice finger position, sight reading, scales, and a bunch of other aspects of playing the piano. And sort of in line with this idea of virtue, when someone is really good at a musical instrument or at the piano, we might call them a virtuoso. According to Aristotle, no matter how much natural ability you may have, you cannot attain expertise without also practicing. Practice makes the necessary skills habitual, or, as we sometimes say, second nature. Right? That's where this idea of second nature comes from. It comes from Aristotle. As this phrase suggests, the desired skill becomes part of one's very nature. Yet, because developed skills aren't inborn or innate, they count as a second nature, as having been added to one's essential character. So now we see how this idea of second nature fits in with Aristotelian ethics. Right? The idea is that these are learned skills that we practice so much that they become second nature. They become as if they were innate, but they were in fact learned. Unfortunately, it's also possible, of course, to practice bad habits. And by practicing a tennis serve incorrectly, for example, we might actually become worse at serving a tennis ball. Similarly, by repeating the wrong fingering when we're practicing our piano, this may make us a worse pianist. As coaches and musicians know, avoiding such mistakes require the learner to have the right knowledge of how things are supposed to be done. A person must fulfill several conditions to count as having attained excellence. First, a person must know what the right thing is. Then, a person must intend to do the right thing because it's the right thing, right? So you need to know what the right thing is. You need to do the right thing because it's the right thing. And a person's right action must be the product of their own firm and unchangeable character, right? This means that their behavioral patterns are habitual or second nature, all right? So, to have virtue of courage, for example, I can't simply have acted courageously once or twice. I must also know what courage is, and I must intend to act courageously because I hold courage to be a good, right? Notice that, again, it's not enough to appear as if we've acted courageously. You must intend to act that way. Finally, courage must be one of my enduring character traits, as evidenced by the fact that I typically act courageously. So, to actually act courageously, it needs to be related to my character. And I can't properly be considered courageous unless I fulfill all of these conditions. No one becomes virtuous except by years of practice, according to Aristotle. There's no shortcuts. Further, no one is born virtuous. Aristotle's proof of this is simply that people's characters can change in the direction of either vice or virtue. So this suggests to Aristotle that we couldn't have been born virtuous because we can go either way naturally. Such changes are possible only if virtue and vice can be acquired. What belongs to our innate nature, after all, cannot normally be changed, at least so the thinking goes. Still, the potential for developing virtue is innate to normal human nature because virtue is living in accordance with reason, and the ability to reason uniquely characterizes human nature. But what exactly is a virtue? Aristotle's famous doctrine is that each virtue lies at the golden mean between some excess and a deficiency. This balance involves how a person feels as well as how a person acts. One can face a threat, for instance, in a variety of ways. We can face a threat recklessly, so we could be like a reckless adventurer who takes foolish risks at the excess, while the cowardly person falls on the side of deficiency. The courageous person, however, achieves the mean, right, or the proper balance between these two extremes. This is not to say that the mean is always exactly halfway between two extremes. True courage, for example, I think we could all agree, probably follows closer to the excess than the deficiency. In any case, virtue achieves balance, while the extremes represent vices in each direction. So here's kind of how this works. So we have the mean there in the middle, then we have a deficiency on the left and an excess on the right. So courage, which is the mean way that we want to be acting. It's the virtue. The deficiency of courage is cowardliness, whereas the excess of courage is recklessness. And so according to Aristotle, what we're trying to do is find the space between. But notice that it doesn't have to be perfectly between. So true courage is probably closer to recklessness than it is to cowardliness. Similarly with generosity, like courage, generosity probably lies more on the side of excess than deficiency, because for a generous person, giving is ready and free. It's far removed from the stingy actions of the world's Scrooges. Still, the virtue of generosity does not mean the person gives excessively, which harms both the giver and the recipient. So if we're going to put it on our scale from deficiency and excess with mean in the middle, we have generosity there in the middle, with stinginess on the left being the deficiency and being overly generous the excess. So with generosity, you're probably the place we want to balance is a little bit closer to overly generous as opposed to overly stingy. Finally, consider good temperament, the virtue that's related to anger. Those who fly into a rage at the slightest provocation clearly fall on the side of excess with regard to good temper. However, the apathetic and imperturbable individuals who remain unmoved even when they ought to get stirred up belong on the side of a deficiency, you see. So you can have a good temper, but you can be a little bit too far in the negative direction, meaning that you're apathetic. You don't respond to emotions. The good-tempered person finds the proper balance between these. In this case, however, the virtue is located closer to the deficiency than the excess, right? Meaning that it's better to be closer to being apathetic as opposed to being overly excitable. Okay, so here's how this might look. The good-temperedness is a little bit closer to the apathetic than to the aggressive. In sum, virtue achieves the means in how one acts, with the example of courage and generosity, and in how one feels in the example of temper, in accordance with reason. Yet virtue isn't merely a balance of degree. Aristotle describes a generous person as someone who not only knows how much to give, but also knows how to give to the right person at the right time, in the right way, and with the right purpose, right? So this isn't, as I just said, a matter of degree. There's all of these other elements that matter a lot. Virtues involve more than a single skill. Rather, they require a multidimensional skill set that achieves the right balance with respect to degree, selection, and timing, manner, and purpose. Aristotle cautions that the right balance won't be exactly the same for everyone. This brings us back to the several right choices that we saw in the previous video. Just as the quantity of food needed by an athlete in training is very different from what a sedentary 60-year-old with a desk job requires, the amount that a generous rich person would give is going to be different from what a generous poor person will give, right? But they can both be generous and they can both be following their character leading to their virtues. Every individual's character and circumstances are unique, so it's possible for different people in different situations to respond differently, although both respond with equal virtue. This is how Aristotle's account allows for there to be several right choices, as we saw in the previous video. Aristotle's theory has a few practical implications. First, Aristotle warns us that simply thinking and talking about virtue won't make anyone virtuous. This is a nice point, I think. Simply thinking and talking about virtue doesn't make anyone virtuous. It's only by practicing virtuous behavior and avoiding vicious behavior that we develop virtue. Becoming virtuous requires a transformation of character, which needs to begin at an early age. His theory also has things to say about society. A society that may place too much emphasis on rules and rights and not enough on individual character and responsibility is not great, according to Aristotle. On the one hand, Aristotle emphasizes that we'll inevitably become what our repeated choices and actions make us, and we're each a product of our accumulated past choices and practices, after all. And if I lie and deceive for most of my life, I'm going to become a liar, even if finding it difficult to be honest and sincere. So we're not merely responsible for what we do, but also for what we've made ourselves. Yet, responsibility never falls entirely upon each person alone. The social environment also exerts a powerful influence upon the development of individuals' virtue and vice. A healthy society should promote virtue by creating a limited number of good laws under virtuous leadership. Bad laws, too many laws, and poor leadership, on the other hand, make virtue harder for anyone to develop. As Aristotle sees it, developing virtue is both an individual and a social responsibility.